They chained her hands and called it justice, dragged her into a hall filled with wolves who'd already decided she deserved to die, and told her to shift or be branded broken forever. Elise had survived 23 years by staying invisible, by never speaking, by being so forgettable that even cruelty passed her by. But tonight, that was over. The council wanted to force her wolf out to prove she carried no royal blood, no divine blessing, no threat to the kingdom they'd built on genocide. She closed her eyes and reached for something she'd never touched before, and when the light exploded from her body, the moon goddess herself turned to watch. They'd meant to destroy her, but instead, they'd just awakened the one bloodline that could bring their entire world crashing down. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I'd never reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this, the quiet ones, the forbidden ones, the ones that burn slowly in the dark, deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Midnight Stories and help turn whispered tales into something that can't be ignored. Comment below what time and where you are watching from. Now, let's continue. The iron manacles bit into Airless Vera's wrists as two enforcers hauled her through the Moon Hall's towering corridors. She kept her eyes down, her bare feet soundless against the frozen marble, her grey shift dress hanging loose on her thin frame. 23 years she'd survived in the forgotten edges of the realm, sleeping in monastery cellars, eating what the monks could spare, speaking to no one who might ask her name. She'd never set foot in the royal territories before tonight. Now she was being dragged before the kingdom's elite, like a criminal awaiting execution. "Move faster, Phantom!" one enforcer hissed, yanking her forward so violently she stumbled. "Can't believe we have to touch this cursed thing." Erlis said nothing. She'd learned long ago that words only made things worse for those like her, those with no family, no name, no right to exist. The massive doors groaned open, and suddenly she was standing before what looked like every noble house in the kingdom. Hundreds of them seated in tiered stone rows that rose toward a vaulted ceiling carved with celestial scenes. Their eyes tracked her with contempt, with morbid curiosity, with the hungry anticipation of those who'd come to witness a reckoning. At the center of it all, on a raised dais of black stone, sat the Alpha King. Alaric Veilthorn was everything the Whispers claimed he would be. Broad-shouldered and commanding, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes like polished steel. He wore black and silver that spoke of absolute authority, and when his gaze landed on Erlis, she felt it like a blade against her throat. His expression revealed nothing. He simply watched as the enforcers forced her to her knees on the cold floor. "There she is." A woman's voice rang out from beside the throne, dripping with satisfaction. The shadow creature who dares invoke the name of the Starbound. Erlis's head jerked up despite herself. Standing beside the king's throne was the High Seer, tall and severe in robes of deep violet, her silver hair coiled like a crown, and her eyes sharp as winter frost. Beside her, the council elders formed a wall of judgment, each face harder than the last. The High Seer descended from the dais with deliberate grace, circling Erlis like a predator. This pathetic thing has been spreading heresy throughout the outer provinces, claiming connection to a bloodline declared extinct and treasonous, claiming she deserves sanctuary under laws that no longer exist. "I never claimed," Erlis started, but an enforcer's hand clamped over her mouth. "Let her speak." Alaric's voice cut through the hall like a whip crack. The hand dropped instantly. Erlis drew a shaking breath. "I never claimed anything, Alpha King. I don't even know what the Starbound were. I've never spoken to anyone except to beg for shelter." "Lies," the High Seer purred. "My sources heard you reciting the old prayers, invoking the goddess by her forbidden names. You've been marked by something unnatural since the monks found you in those scorched ruins." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, more hostile. Someone shouted that the Starbound had been traitors. Someone else called her a corruption that should have died with the rest. The High Seer's smile widened. "There's a simple way to settle this, isn't there?" She turned to Alaric, her voice honey-sweet. Make her shift, my king. If she truly carries forbidden blood, her wolf will prove it. But if she's lying, if she's just another hollow creature with delusions of ancestry, the shift will break her permanently. Erlis's blood turned to ice. She'd never shifted. Not once. She didn't even know if she could. Alaric studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind those steel eyes. Can you shift? I don't know, Erlis whispered. Then we'll find out. He nodded to the High Seer. Begin the ritual. The chains around Erlis's wrists fell away as an enforcer unlocked them, but she barely felt the relief. The High Seer was already moving, drawing symbols on the marble floor with silver dust that glowed faintly in the torchlight. Ancient markings that made the air itself feel heavier, colder. The blood rejection ritual, the High Seer announced to the assembled nobles, her voice carrying the weight of ceremony, was created 5 centuries ago to sever false claims to power. When a shifter attempts transformation under its influence, the ritual strips away any bloodline connection they falsely invoke. If they survive the process, they are marked as Omega for life. Powerless, packless, permanently broken. Erlis's throat tightened. She'd heard whispers of such rituals in the monastery libraries, ancient texts the monks thought she couldn't read. This wasn't just a test. It was an execution dressed as justice. Of course, the High Seer continued, her smile sharp. The ritual only severs false claims. True bloodlines remain untouched. So if this creature truly carries starbound ancestry as she implies, she has nothing to fear. She gestured to the glowing circle. Step forward, Phantom. Prove yourself, or be broken. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, hungry for spectacle. Elise could feel their anticipation like a physical pressure against her skin. They wanted her to fail. They needed her to fail, because her existence threatened something they'd built their lives upon. The certainty that the starbound were gone, that the old power structures would never be challenged. This was how ruling systems survived, Erlis realized with sudden clarity. They didn't just eliminate threats. They turned elimination into tradition, into ritual, into something the people would gather to witness and celebrate. They made cruelty look like order. She stepped into the circle on trembling legs. The silver dust flared brighter the moment her bare feet crossed the boundary, and she felt something wrap around her chest like invisible chains. The ritual was already working, already reaching into whatever core of power she might possess. From his throne, Alaric's eyes narrowed. His wolf stirred beneath his skin, restless in a way it hadn't been in years. Something about this felt wrong. The girl was terrified, yes, but there was something else, something his instincts recognized before his mind could name it. He found himself leaning forward despite himself, every alpha instinct screaming that he should stop this. But the law was clear. The council had invoked their right to trial by ritual, and he was bound by the very traditions that had kept his kingdom stable for generations. Erlis closed her eyes, reaching for something she'd never truly touched before. She had no idea what her wolf looked like, if it even existed. The monks had told her she was different, marked, but they'd never explained what that meant. She'd spent her entire life suppressing whatever strangeness lurked beneath her skin, afraid that acknowledging it would make her even more of a target. Now she had no choice. She reached deeper, past fear, past shame, past the voice that whispered she was nothing. And something reached back. Her body began to change. The crowd gasped as light, not the warm glow of a normal shift, but something colder, brighter, began to emanate from her skin. The silver circle around her blazed, fighting against whatever was awakening, but the light grew stronger. Erlis's bones began to reshape, and she screamed. The pain was unlike anything Erlis had imagined. Not the clean break of bones reshaping, but something deeper, as if her very soul was tearing free from constraints that had bound it since birth. The silver circle blazed white-hot, fighting against the transformation, trying to sever whatever bloodline dared to manifest. But the light pouring from her body grew brighter, stronger, overwhelming the ritual's ancient magic like dawn-consuming shadow. When the shift completed, the moon hall fell into absolute silence. Airless opened her eyes, no longer pale grey but burning gold, and saw the assembly staring at her in something that looked like horror or awe. She couldn't tell which. She looked down at herself and froze. Her wolf wasn't the grey or brown of common shifters, nor even the black of alpha bloodlines. Her fur glowed like captured starlight, silvery white and luminous, with threads of actual celestial light running through it like veins. Where her paws touched the marble floor, the stone itself began to glow, ancient sigils hidden for centuries, suddenly blazing to life beneath her feet. The light spread outward in rippling waves, racing across the floor, up the columns, illuminating carvings that hadn't been visible in generations. She was massive, larger than any beta, matching the size of the Alpha King himself. Power radiated from her in visible waves that made the torches flicker and the air itself shimmer with heat. Impossible, the High Seer's voice cracked, all composure shattered. This is a trick, some kind of dark magic. A starbound hasn't walked this realm in 500 years. She cannot be. The words died in her throat as the moon hall itself responded. The stone walls hummed with a sound that was felt more than heard, a resonance that made every wolf's bones vibrate in recognition. The ancient sigils weren't just glowing, they were moving, reforming into patterns that predated the current kingdom, predated the fall of the starbound, predated everything the council claimed as truth. Wolves throughout the hall began to shift backward in their seats, instinct overriding curiosity. Some covered their eyes against the brightness, others dropped to their knees, unable to resist the primal urge to submit before something older and more powerful than any living authority. The High Seer stumbled back toward the dais, her silver dust scattered and useless. The other council members were on their feet now, their carefully constructed certainty crumbling. This wasn't supposed to happen. The ritual was meant to break her, to prove she was nothing, to eliminate any threat she might pose. Instead, they had awakened something that should have stayed buried. Alaric rose from his throne in one fluid motion, his wolf surging so close to the surface that his eyes flashed pure silver. Every instinct in his body was roaring at him. Recognition, protection, something primal and undeniable that he couldn't name. He descended the dais steps slowly, unable to look away from the luminous creature standing in the center of his hall. She was magnificent, terrifying, impossible, and something in his soul knew her. Erlis's wolf made a sound deep in her chest, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Her golden eyes tracked the Alpha King's approach, but she didn't retreat. Couldn't retreat. Her instincts were screaming at her too, recognizing something essential in him that her human mind didn't understand. Behind the throne, carved from white marble and standing 30 feet tall, was the ancient statue of the moon goddess, the same statue that had watched over this hall for 1,000 years, unchanging and eternal. A beautiful figure with arms outstretched toward the eastern windows, face turned skyward in eternal supplication. The statue's head began to turn, stone grinding against stone, slow and deliberate. The goddess's marble face rotated downward until her carved eyes were pointed directly at Erlis. The sound echoed through the hall like thunder, like prophecy, like judgment itself. Her outstretched arms shifted, palms opening toward the Starlight wolf in a gesture of blessing that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. The moon hall erupted into chaos. Wolves were on their feet, shouting, scrambling toward the exits. Some fell to their knees in reverence, others pressed against the walls in terror. The council members stood frozen on the dais, their faces drained of color, staring at the impossible sight before them. The moon goddess wasn't just turning, she was descending. The marble began to glow with the same celestial light that poured from Erlis's wolf, and the statue moved with fluid grace that defied its stone construction. She stepped down from her pedestal, each footfall silent despite her immense size, until she stood at the edge of the ritual circle. Her carved features softened into something almost alive, and when she spoke, her voice resonated through every mind in the hall simultaneously, not heard, but felt in the marrow of bones. Enough. The single word carried absolute authority. Every wolf in the moon hall collapsed to their knees as if struck by an invisible force. Nobles and servants, enforcers and council members, alphas and omegas, all of them driven down by instinct older than language, older than civilization itself. The divine will of the goddess permitted no resistance. All of them except Erlis. The Starlight wolf remained standing, her luminous form reflected in the goddess's marble eyes. The deity's hands extended further, cupping the air around Erlis in a gesture of unmistakable protection. "This one is mine," marked by my hand before her first breath. The starbound were never extinguished. They were hidden, scattered, erased from your records and your memory. The goddess's presence expanded, filling every corner of the hall. "You built your kingdom on the bones of those I blessed. You called it law. You called it order. You called it tradition." The council members were weeping now, faces pressed to the marble, unable to even lift their heads. But legitimacy does not come from consensus. Truth is not determined by those who hold power. It exists whether you acknowledge it or not. The goddess turned her gaze to the high seer, and the woman flinched as if burned. "The ritual you invoked to destroy this child has instead restored what you tried to sever. The bloodline you declared extinct stands before you, whole and sacred." Erlis shifted back to human form without meaning to, the transformation gentle this time, guided by something beyond her control. She stood naked and glowing in the center of the ritual circle, starlight still threading through her pale hair, her skin luminous in the torchlight. The goddess's power wrapped around her like a cloak, shielding her from the hundreds of eyes that could not look away. Erlis Vera, last daughter of the starbound sanctuaries, you are recognized. You are restored. And any who raise hand or claw against you, raise them against me. The presence began to fade, the statue slowly returning to its pedestal, but the blessing remained visible. Threads of silver light connecting the goddess's outstretched hands to Erlis's chest, pulsing gently with each breath. Alaric was still on his knees, but his wolf was no longer restrained. It surged against his control, howling with recognition, with need, with something that felt like destiny crashing through every wall he'd built around himself. He forced his head up, meeting Erlis's golden gaze across the hall, and felt his entire world tilt on its axis. The mate bond ignited like lightning striking the same place twice. Silver light blazed from him to her, intertwining with the goddess's blessing, visible to everyone still kneeling in the hall. The connection was physical, undeniable, searing through his chest and down his spine with enough force to make him gasp. He saw her eyes widen as she felt it too, the bond snapping into place with the inevitability of gravity, of seasons, of celestial bodies locked in eternal orbit. His betrothed was seated somewhere in the hall witnessing this. The council who'd arranged that political marriage was watching their carefully constructed alliance crumble. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the woman standing in starlight, looking at him with fear and wonder, and something that mirrored the wild recognition in his own chest. The goddess had not just blessed her. She had chosen her for him, and the kingdom would have to burn before he let anyone take her from him now. Alaric rose to his feet before the council could find their voices. His movement was fluid, predatory, every inch the Alpha King as he descended from the dais, and crossed the hall toward Airless. The mate bond pulled him forward like a tide he had no interest in resisting. "Alpha King, wait!" The High Seer's voice cracked with desperation. "You must not approach her. The ritual is incomplete. She could be dangerous, unstable. She's my mate." The words came out rough, primal, leaving no room for debate. "The goddess herself has declared it. Stand down." The crowd remained on their knees, but their eyes tracked his every movement. Some looked awed, others horrified. Alaric didn't care. His wolf was too close to the surface, his control fracturing with each step that brought him closer to the woman who'd just rewritten his entire existence. Erlis watched him approach, still wrapped in the goddess's fading light, and something fierce flickered across her face. Not submission, not even fear. Recognition, yes. The bond sang between them, silver and starlight intertwining invisible threads that made the air shimmer. But beneath it was something harder, something that refused to bend simply because divine will said she should. Alaric stopped 3 feet away, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin, to smell moonlight and winter forests, and something indefinably her. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "But I'm not yours just because a bond says so." The statement should have enraged his wolf, should have triggered every dominant instinct bred into alpha bloodlines for generations. Instead, it made something in his chest tighten with respect, with want that had nothing to do with divine mandate and everything to do with the woman standing before him, glowing and unbroken despite everything they'd tried to do to her. "I know." He shrugged out of his formal cloak and draped it around her shoulders, the gesture purely protective. "But the bond is real, and it's equal." That made her eyes widen slightly. The mate bonds she would have heard stories about, if she'd heard any stories at all, were always hierarchical. Alpha dominant, omega submissive. But the silver light wrapping around them both pulsed with identical intensity, neither strand brighter or stronger than the other. The goddess had bound equals, not master and servant. From the dais, a council elder finally found his courage. This changes nothing. The betrothal contract between the Vale Thorn Line and House Meridian has stood for 3 years. It cannot simply be, "It's void." Alaric didn't even look back. Goddess law supersedes mortal contracts. "You know this." "Perhaps," the High Seer interjected, her voice carefully controlled despite the tremor beneath it. "But this woman remains a threat to the stability of the realm. The Starbound were declared traitors for attempting to overthrow." "The Starbound were murdered." Erlis's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Every eye snapped to her. "You can dress it up however you want, call it law or justice or tradition. But the goddess just told you the truth. Your kingdom was built on genocide." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nobles who'd started to rise sank back to their knees. The council members exchanged sharp glances, and Alaric saw the moment their shock crystallized into something more dangerous. Fear. And fear in powerful people always led to the same place. "That woman," the High Seer said slowly, "has just confessed to carrying the blood of traitors. She is a direct threat to the crown, to this kingdom, to everything we have built. Mate bond or not, Alpha King, she cannot be allowed to live." The hall erupted in argument, but Alaric heard none of it. He'd stepped between Erlis and the council without thinking. His wolf fully at the surface now, power rolling off him in waves that made the weaker nobles whimper. "Try it," he said softly, "and see what happens." Alaric didn't sleep that night. He'd secured Erlis in his private chambers, the only place in the palace he trusted to be truly safe, and posted guards he'd personally selected outside the door. Then he'd gone down into the depths of the palace, into the archives that had been sealed since his father's reign. The mate bond hummed in his chest like a second heartbeat, letting him feel Erlis's wakefulness, her anxiety, her stubborn refusal to rest even though she was safe. He understood. Safety was a foreign concept when you'd spent 23 years surviving. The archive keys had been in his possession since his coronation, but he'd never used them. His father had left explicit instructions that certain records were sealed for reasons of national security, never to be opened. Alaric had trusted that, respected it even. Now he understood it for what it was, a cover-up. The documents were exactly where the old registry said they'd be, preserved in wax-sealed cases that cracked when he broke them open. Treaties, land transfers, execution orders, and beneath it all, correspondence between his father and the council elders of that era, written in their own hands. The truth was worse than he'd imagined. The Starbound hadn't rebelled. They'd been invited to the capital for peace negotiations, for discussions about integrating their sanctuaries more fully into the kingdom's governance. They'd come unarmed in good faith, bringing their families, their children, and they'd been slaughtered in a single night. Alaric's hands shook as he read the casualty lists. Entire bloodlines eliminated, sanctuaries burned to the ground. The survivors? There had been survivors scattered and hidden, hunted systematically over the following months. Orders had been given to leave no trace, to ensure the Starbound name became nothing more than a cautionary tale about challenging royal authority. The land seizures had happened immediately. Starbound territories, rich with resources and strategically positioned, were divided among the noble houses who'd supported the massacre. New titles were created, new fortunes built. The entire power structure of the current kingdom rested on stolen ground and innocent blood. The High Seer's family name appeared again and again in the documents. Her grandfather had orchestrated much of it, advising the king on how to frame the massacre as necessary, how to control the narrative, how to make sure history remembered the Starbound as traitors rather than victims. And there, in a sealed envelope marked with his father's personal seal, Alaric found the final piece. A report dated 23 years ago. A Starbound infant had been found in the ruins of the northernmost sanctuary, hidden in a root cellar beneath the burning building. The scout who'd found her had been ordered to eliminate her. Instead, he'd left her at a monastery, reasoning that an unnamed child with no documentation would simply disappear into obscurity. No one would know. No one would care. The scout's name had been struck from the records, executed probably for disobeying orders. But the child had survived. Alaric stared at the faded description, pale hair, unusually quiet, marked with a birthmark on her left shoulder blade in the shape of a crescent moon, and felt rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. They'd known. The council had known a Starbound heir existed, and they'd chosen to let her suffer in poverty and obscurity rather than simply finish what they'd started. Because killing her outright risked divine retribution. But letting her live as nothing, as no one, erased the threat just as effectively. Until tonight, when they'd forced her to shift and accidentally restored everything they'd tried to destroy. He gathered the documents, every damning page, and returned to his chambers as dawn broke over the palace. Erlis was awake, standing by the window wrapped in his cloak, watching the sun rise over a kingdom built on her family's graves. "I found the truth," he said quietly. She turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Tell me." He did. All of it. The planned massacre, the land seizures, the deliberate erasure, the scout who'd saved her life by abandoning her to obscurity. She listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each revelation, until he finished with the most painful truth of all. You weren't forgotten. You were hidden. They knew you existed, and they chose to let you suffer because it was safer than acknowledging what they'd done. Erlis was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't remember them. My family. I don't remember anything before the monastery. I don't even know if they loved me. They died protecting you." Alaric crossed to her, the mate bond pulling him closer. "They hid you so well that even in the massacre you survived. That was love." She turned away, but not before he saw the tears. Grief for people she'd never know, for a life stolen before she could remember it, for 23 years of suffering that had been deliberate, calculated, chosen by those who now sat in power. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I present this evidence to the full assembly. The High Seer and the council families will face trial for—" "They won't accept it," she looked at him over her shoulder. "They've spent 500 years building their power on starbound graves. You think they'll just surrender because you found some old documents? The goddess herself blessed you. They have no choice." "Don't they?" Her smile was bitter. "They challenged divine will the moment they demanded my execution. What makes you think they'll stop now?" As if summoned by her words, a knock sounded at the chamber door. One of Alaric's guards entered, his expression grim. "Alpha King, the council has convened an emergency session. They're invoking the Sovereign Crisis Protocol." Alaric's blood went cold. The protocol hadn't been used in 200 years. It allowed the council to override the king's authority if they could prove the crown had been compromised by outside influence or manipulation. They were going to try to remove him from power. And once he was gone, nothing would stop them from finishing what they'd started 23 years ago. Erlis met his eyes across the room, and he saw understanding dawn in her expression. "They're not going to let this go," she said quietly. "One of us is going to have to die." The emergency session convened within the hour. The Moon Hall filled once again with nobles who'd barely had time to process what they'd witnessed the night before. Alaric stood at the center of the dais, the sealed documents laid out before him. Erlis at his side despite the council's protests. The mate bond pulsed between them, visible to anyone who cared to look, and he felt her steady presence like an anchor in a storm. The High Seer stood with the council elders, her expression carved from ice. "The Sovereign Crisis Protocol is clear. When the Crown's judgment has been compromised by supernatural influence or coercion, the Council may intervene to protect the realm." "The mate bond is not coercion," Alaric said, his voice deadly calm. "It's divine will." "Is it?" An elder stepped forward, a man named Corvus, whose family holdings had once been starbound territory. "Or is it manipulation by a creature trained in the old magics? The starbound were known for their ability to enchant, to bend wills, to make others see what they wanted them to see." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Alaric felt Erlis stiffen beside him, felt her anger through the bond, but she remained silent. "Furthermore," Corvus continued, emboldened, "this woman's very existence is a threat to the stability we have maintained for 5 centuries. The documents the Alpha King presents are old, their context lost. We cannot allow sentiment or," he glanced at Erlis with barely concealed disgust, "base attraction to overturn the foundations of our society." "Then let me prove it." Erlis's voice rang clear through the hall. Every head turned toward her. "You claim I'm nothing but manipulation and old magic. Challenge me. Let one of your champions face me, wolf to wolf. If I'm as weak and false as you say, they'll destroy me easily." "Erlis, no," Alaric started, but she cut him off with a look. "I'm not doing this for you," she said quietly, though the whole hall heard her. "I'm doing this for every starbound who died in silence. They deserve to be seen." Corvus's smile was vicious. "I accept on behalf of the council. My son Theron will serve as champion." He gestured to a massive man in the front row, easily the size of an alpha, with scars that spoke of 100 victories. "If you survive, we will hear your petition. When you fall, this farce ends." The crowd pulled back, forming the same rough circle they'd made for the ritual, but this time the silver dust remained undrawn. This was pure dominance, wolf against wolf, the oldest form of justice their kind knew. Theron shifted first, his transformation smooth and practiced. His wolf was enormous, coal black with amber eyes, radiating aggression and certainty. He snarled, showing teeth every line of his body promising violence. Airlis walked to the center of the circle, and Alaric felt her fear through the bond. Not of Theron, but of what she was about to reveal. She'd shifted only once before, under coercion, barely in control. Now she was choosing it. She closed her eyes and let her wolf rise. The transformation was faster this time, graceful, as if the goddess's blessing had settled into her bones and taught her body what it was meant to be. When the Starlight wolf emerged, she was bigger than before. Fed and rested, no longer suppressed by years of starvation and fear, she matched Theron's size completely. Her fur blazed with celestial light that made the torches dim by comparison, and where her paws touched stone, the ancient sigils flared back to life. Theron lunged without warning, going for her throat in a move designed to end the fight before it truly began. Airlis didn't dodge. She simply stood her ground, and the light around her intensified until it became almost solid. Theron's teeth closed on empty air as the radiance pushed him back like an invisible hand. He tried again, circling, feinting, looking for an opening, but every time he got close, the light repelled him, gentle but absolutely unyielding. She wasn't fighting him. She was simply existing, and her existence alone was too powerful for him to overcome. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Theron exhausted himself against an opponent who refused to strike back. Finally, sides heaving, he retreated to the edge of the circle and shifted back to human form, dropping to one knee in instinctive submission. "I cannot touch her," he said, his voice carrying shock and something like awe. "It's like trying to fight the sun itself." The goddess's presence filled the hall, not manifesting, not speaking, but unmistakably there. A weight in the air, a certainty that pressed against every wolf's consciousness. The divine watched, and she was pleased. One by one, nobles throughout the assembly rose and knelt, not to Alaric, to Airlis. On the dais, the High Seer's face drained of all colour. Beside her, Corvus stumbled backward, and another elder simply collapsed, the weight of centuries of lies finally crushing him beneath divine truth. The council was falling apart before their eyes. The trials began 3 days later, held not in the Moon Hall but in the open courtyard where all citizens could witness. Alaric had insisted on transparency. Centuries of corruption couldn't be dismantled in darkness. The High Seer stood in chains, her violet robe stripped away, replaced with plain grey cloth. Beside her, Corvus and 4 other council elders faced charges of conspiracy, genocide, land theft, and obstruction of divine will. The evidence Alaric had found filled 3 tables: documents, correspondence, land transfers, all of it damning. The Starbound massacre was not rebellion, Alaric announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard. It was calculated extermination. These families, he gestured to the accused, built their fortunes on stolen land and innocent blood. They erased an entire people from history and called it law. The High Seer's composure finally cracked. We did what was necessary. The Starbound were growing too powerful, too influential with the common wolves. They would have destabilized everything. They would have challenged your authority, Airlis interrupted, stepping forward. She wore simple clothing, refusing the formal gowns Alaric had offered, but the starlight in her hair made her more regal than any noble in attendance. That's not the same as being a threat. You murdered them because they represented accountability, because they answered to the goddess instead of you, the crowd murmured. Many had lost ancestors in the aftermath of the massacre, families displaced when starbound territories were seized, bloodlines scattered when the old sanctuaries burned. The truth was finally giving shape to grief they'd carried for generations without understanding why. The trials lasted a week. Under goddess law, which superseded mortal statutes, the verdict was inevitable. The High Seer and her co-conspirators were found guilty on all counts. Their titles were revoked, their lands reclaimed, Their family names struck from the nobility registries. The stolen territories would be returned to their rightful stewards, or, where no heirs existed, transformed into sanctuaries open to all. It was the educational principle Airless had insisted upon. Accountability dismantles tyranny, but only when the systems that enabled it are rebuilt from the foundation. The old hierarchy is dissolved, Alaric declared on the final day of trials. No more councils that answer to no one. No more sealed archives and convenient erasures. This kingdom will have transparency, representation, and laws that serve all wolves, not just those born into power. The crowd erupted in approval, but Alaric's eyes were on Airless. She stood apart from the celebration, her expression unreadable, and he felt her conflict through the mate bond like a physical ache. That night, in his chambers, he finally asked, "What's wrong? We won. The truth is out. Justice was served. You want me to be your lunar queen." It wasn't a question. The mate bond doesn't obligate me to accept a throne built on my family's graves. She turned to face him, and he saw the steel beneath her quiet exterior. You're dissolving the old hierarchy, yes, but you're still king. You still hold absolute authority. You're just promising to use it better. What would you have me do? Share it. She moved closer, and the mate bond flared between them, silver and starlight intertwining. Not as your queen, subordinate to your authority, as your equal. Co-rulers, bound by the bond but autonomous in power. Make it law that neither of us can act without the other's consent on matters of the kingdom. Alaric's wolf bristled at the suggestion, alpha instincts rebelling against shared dominance. But his human mind understood what she was offering. True partnership. The kind of balance the Starbound had represented before they were destroyed. The nobles will resist, he said quietly. Then they can join the High Seer in exile. Her smile was sharp. The goddess chose me for this, Alaric. Not to be your pretty ornament or your subordinate mate. She chose me to make sure this kingdom never again becomes a place where power can hide genocide behind tradition. He studied her face. This woman who'd survived 23 years of deliberate obscurity, who'd been forced to shift to prove she was nothing, who'd risen instead as something the kingdom couldn't ignore or destroy. She was right. She'd always been right. Equal authority, he said. Shared power. No decisions without consensus between us. And? She raised an eyebrow. And when we disagree, we figure it out together instead of one of us submitting to the other. He closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face. Is that what you want? It's what I need. Her voice softened. I won't become another trophy on a throne, Alaric. I can't. Then you won't. He kissed her forehead, sealing the promise. We'll remake this kingdom together. She pulled back slightly, her golden eyes searching his. There's something else, something I need to do before I accept any throne. Name it. I want to find them, the other survivors. The search took 6 months. Airless travelled to every forgotten corner of the kingdom, following whispers and half-remembered stories, finding starbound descendants who'd survived by hiding in plain sight. A baker whose grandmother had fled the massacre as a child. A merchant whose unusual dreams had always marked him as different. A healer in the northern provinces whose touch carried light she'd learned to suppress. 23 survivors in total, scattered and hidden, each carrying fragments of a heritage they'd been too afraid to claim. Alaric travelled with her, not as king but as mate, watching her transform from the frightened woman dragged in chains to someone who could look survivors in the eye and say, "You're not alone anymore. Come home." The Starbound Sanctuary was rebuilt on the original site, where Erlise had been found as an infant. The scorched earth had spent 23 years healing, and now it bloomed with construction. Halls of learning, meditation gardens, archives to preserve the truth that had almost been lost forever. It would be a place of scholarship and spiritual practice, open to all who sought the goddess's wisdom, never again exclusive or isolated enough to be seen as a threat. On the day of the sanctuary's dedication, Erlis stood before the assembled kingdom and formally accepted her title. Not Lunar Queen. That spoke of subordination. She and Alaric would be called the twin sovereigns, equal rulers bound by the mate bond but autonomous in authority. The Starbound were destroyed because they represented accountability, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd, because they refused to let power go unchallenged. I accept this role not to rule, but to restore what was stolen, to make sure this kingdom never again confuses cruelty with strength or erasure with order. Alaric stood beside her, and when she finished speaking, he took her hand. The mate bond blazed between them, visible to everyone watching, but there was no dominance in it, just balance. Two equals choosing each other, choosing this burden together. That night, alone in the chambers they now shared by choice rather than necessity, Alaric finally let himself touch her the way he'd wanted to since the moment the bond had snapped into place. But he waited, hands gentle on her face, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. She didn't retreat. She pulled him closer, and the desire that had been building between them for months finally found release. Not forced by divine mandate or alpha dominance, but chosen. Mutual. Two people who'd found each other across an impossible divide and decided to stay. Afterward, she lay wrapped in his arms, starlight still threading through her hair, and whispered, "I'm glad it was you. Even though I'm descended from the king who ordered your family killed? You're not your father." She turned to look at him. "You proved that every day for 6 months. You let me lead. You listened. You shared power when every instinct probably told you not to. My instincts told me you were right." He kissed her temple. "They still do." The kingdom rebuilt slowly, painfully, but it rebuilt. Laws were rewritten to prevent the concentration of power that had enabled the massacre. The council was reformed with representatives from every territory, including Starbound descendants. Archives were opened, histories rewritten to include the voices that had been silenced. It wasn't perfect. There were nobles who resisted, who clung to the old ways, who whispered that the Alpha King had been bewitched by a phantom. But they were outnumbered by those who'd seen the truth, who'd watched the goddess herself intervene, who understood that legitimacy came from justice, not tradition. A year after the trials, Erlis stood in the Moon Hall once more. But this time she walked in freely, crowned and sovereign, her hand in Alaric's as they addressed the assembly. Where she'd once knelt in chains, she now stood equal to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. The moon goddess statue watched from its pedestal, still turned toward them in eternal blessing, and Erlis felt the warmth of divine approval settle over her like a cloak. She'd been dragged into this hall to be broken, to be erased, to prove she was nothing. Instead, she'd become everything they'd feared, everything the goddess had intended. The Starbound had returned, and they would never be silenced again. Did this story speak to you? Let us know in the comments what moment resonated most. And tell us where you're watching from so we can give you a shout out in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on our next uploads. The next chapter of power, destiny, and forbidden bonds awaits.